Hey folks, it's Mira Dessy, the Ingredient Guru, and I am so delighted to share my guest with you today. I am talking with James Templeton, and James is, well, first and foremost, he's a fifth generation Texan, so very proud of the great state of Texas. And he also is someone who healed himself from stage 4 cancer. He's been cancer-free for over 30 years. And in his journey to wellness, he went on and founded Uni Key Health Systems, as well as the Templeton Wellness Foundation. James is also the author of this new book, I Used to Have Cancer. Sorry, it's hard to read backwards. I Used to Have Cancer, How I Found My Own Way Back to Health. And so we are going to have a lovely conversation. James, thank you so much for joining me today.
Mira, it's great to see you and be with you today.
Well, I'm really delighted. I have to say, I loved reading this book. It was very interesting. You can see all of my little sticky notes here. There's tons of information in this book about a very different path towards dealing with the diagnosis of cancer. Can you tell us just like a little bit about your story, how you discovered you had cancer?
Well, yes, I was living in Texas, of course, then, and I was just a regular guy. I was a guy that had several very successful small businesses. I had a wife, and I had a little girl that wasn't even 2 years old yet. And I thought I had everything going for me, I guess you could say. And I like to say I felt like I had life by the tail. I felt like I was a young guy, had businesses, everything was going for me. And I even thought I was in pretty good health. I thought I was in pretty good shape. I ran a lot. I was into working out and running, and everywhere people would drive around town, they'd see me running down the side of the road. I was one of those real running guys back then. But I got into this running thing because my father, my grandfather, both died of heart disease at a very young age. And my mother, that I never really knew, died before I was 2. And I had a brother that was died at the age of 8. So I had a lot of death in my family, and I guess I thought I was going to be next. And at one point in my life, when I was a little younger than this, I thought I wouldn't make it to 30. And I just kind of had this kind of what's the use kind of attitude when I was going through college. And I felt that, why should I? My father died when I was a senior in high school, and that really kind of just did me in there for 2 or 3 years. And I just didn't know what to do with myself other than to go out and have fun and enjoy life. And that's what I tried to do. But back to the running story and about the reason I was doing this because of the heart disease, I also read a book, and it was by a fellow by the name of Jim Fixx. And Jim Fixx was a running guru back in those days, and he wrote a book called The Complete Book of Running. And he had the same kind of issues. His father died, I believe it was at the age of 35. And Jim was a guy that got into running and changed his ways and stopped smoking and stopped, doing the things that he was doing and got into running. And he felt that he could sidestep the heart problem if he ran. So I wanted to do the same thing. I thought, well, if he can do it, why can't I? So I got myself into running. I'd run a little bit before, but I got into it heavy duty, and I started to feel so much better. But I did notice one thing, and people will ask me, well, did you notice anything? I did notice that I had a lot of colds and flus all the time, and a lot of sinus problems. Every time I turned around, I felt like I was having all these sinus issues, and I had polyps in my sinuses, and I had, just was allergic to everything. But I thought, well, it's probably because I'm out running all the time, and I'll just push harder. I was tired a lot too. But I thought that's just from the running, and I was 30 over 30 years old. And I thought, well, that's because I'm older now, you know, and I just kind of wrote it off. But one day I went to the office to one of my businesses, and I sat down and I grabbed the newspaper, that morning newspaper, and here I am reading this newspaper, and I thumbed through the paper, and here's a headline that said, you know, running guru Jim Fixx dies of a heart attack while jogging. And I'm like, what? Wait a minute, did I see that right? So, you know, I almost fell out of my chair, and I was drinking a cup of coffee, and I didn't know what to think. And I think before I was finished realizing what had really happened, you know, my coffee had gotten cold because I was sitting there, you know, just thinking really hard about this. And I could not believe it, that this guy that was in such good shape died of a heart attack on the side of the road. So I didn't want to be the next guy, and I felt I better go get checked out and get one of these cardio stress tests that I'd heard about. So I went to a heart specialist, and I got a cardio stress test done there, and he got me in there, got me on the treadmill test, and they would elevate my, you know, my heartbeat and my cardiovascular system up higher. The higher they could go, the more I'd start running really hard. And then the doctor would say, my gosh, he said, James, he says, you're in tremendous shape. He says, you know, I don't think anybody's ever gotten this far with this on this treadmill, you know, on this stress test. He said, you broke the record of the people that have been in here. I think you broke the all-time record. He says, whatever you're doing, just keep doing it, because he says, you're in tremendous shape. And he says, I think you're going to live a long time as long as you stay in this kind of shape. But, you know, after a complete exam, he told me, he says, you seem to be the picture of health. Well, I thought, well, that's a relief. You know, I guess I'm doing something right. And so the next thing, though, on the way out, he says, there's only one thing, he says, that I noticed. He says, there's a mole on your back, and he said, it looks a little suspicious. And he said to me, he says, it's probably nothing to it. But he said, next time you get a chance, go down to the dermatologist and get it checked out. He says, I wouldn't worry about it, but, you know, just whenever you get a chance. So I, you know, didn't think much about it. And I thought to myself, well, I guess I'll get down there when I can. And before long, I went to the dermatologist, and I went in his office and took my shirt off, and he says, what seems to be the problem? And I said to him, I said, well, I got a mole on my back that my doctor that I had a cardio stress test done with said to come get it checked out. And he says, well, let's look at it. And I turned around, he looked at me, and he says, oh my gosh, he says, I think you might have melanoma right off the bat. And I mean, I'm just sitting there thinking, oh, well, it's probably nothing, you know. And he says, melanoma. And I said, oh my God, melanoma. Well, I didn't know a lot about melanoma back then, but I'd heard the word. It didn't sound very friendly. And I know that my stepmother told me people, you know, died from cancerous moles. And after hearing that doctor and thinking about that, immediately it came to my mind. And this doctor acted like he had won the lottery or something. He was running around in the room all excited. He tells me, he says, we might have to remove a large portion of your back, you know, tissue around this mole, because he says, I think it's melanoma. He says, and it's serious if it is, and you could die from this. Well, I didn't like his bedside manner. So I said, okay, doctor, I'm going to get back to you and let me think about this. I left. I was so stressed out, so, you know, upset. Here, this guy that thought he had everything going for him, all of a sudden didn't have much going at all, but fear and anxiety. So I went home. My wife was there, and I told her what had happened, and she says, well, I think it'll be okay. You know, let's see about getting a second opinion, because, you know, you don't know for sure. He doesn't know for sure. So I went in, and long story short, I ended up in another dermatologist's office that sent me over to an oncologist office down in Houston. And this guy was supposed to be world renowned and one of the best guys you could go to. And he looks at it and he says, well, it looks suspicious to me also. But he says, the only way we're going to really know is if we go in and take it out. And he says, lay down on this table and we can do it right here in the office. We'll just take a big plug out of your back around that area and we'll just send it into the lab and we'll see what it is. He said, that's all we know to do. So he went in and did that. I went home and he said, don't worry, just go home. I'll give you a call in a few days. Well, all I did was worry.
Yeah.
When someone tells you don't worry and you think you might have melanoma cancer, well, I worried and I walked around in circles and I probably didn't sleep much, but it was almost 2 weeks before I got another call from this doctor. And he calls me up and he says, I got some good news and I got some bad news. One of those kind of phone calls.
Yeah.
And he says to me, the good news is it's melanoma. I went, good news?
What's the bad news?
Well, yeah, melanoma. Can you believe that's good news? He says, but we think we got it all in this area around the perimeter edges of this incision. We think we got it, and we think that it hasn't spread past that area. So that's the good news. And he says the bad news is that it is deep. And it's very deep in the tissue, and that means it's stage 4. He says stage 4 is not what we like to see because stage 4 can spread into other organs, and we really got to keep an eye on it because this stuff can be very aggressive. And he says that it's stage 4 on something they call the Clark scale when they measure melanomas, and it's deep. So you're going to have to come in every 3 months or so, and we're going to check you out. And he says, we'll see exactly, what we, can find when you come in. But he says that's all we know to do is just come in and get a regular checkup. We'll check your lymph nodes and all that. And he says, just try not to worry. Just, just go about your normal life. He says there's nothing you can do at this point. He says just come in every 3 months.
Sorry, did they offer you any conventional treatment at all because you had a...
He didn't then. He says it's the only conventional thing we would do at this point is just get checked out and then hope for the best. And hopefully he said that, we'll hope that we never see it again. But,
sure.
Mira, I went home and all I did was walk in circles. I was so depressed and so out of sorts that I wasn't this happy-go-lucky guy anymore. I wasn't this guy that was ambitious. I wasn't this guy that wanted to go to work every day. I didn't want to do any of that. All I wanted to do is feel sorry for myself. I didn't feel good. I started to look into what melanoma really was and stage 4 melanoma. And we didn't have the internet back then.
Yeah.
We didn't have all this. So
sure.
I started to dig and I would hear from different people. And I found out even that people that had stage 4 melanoma, which wasn't good news, that they didn't live most of the time past more than 3 years. Well, when I heard that just did me in like nothing ever had before. And I just wasn't a happy camper. I wasn't easy to be around. And it started to create issues with my marriage. And before I knew it, the marriage basically ended. And my wife had moved into town, and I think it was too much for her at the time. And I didn't have enough of the right kind of energy to really fight for my marriage the way I should have, and I just was like floored after that. And I felt like my life was over, and what's the use after that? And, there's no hope for me, going forward because, I don't have any support. I went through all this kind of stuff. But before I knew it, I found a lump in my groin. And I'd gone out and been, going out partying with old friends on the back side of town, and I had to get this stuff off my mind. And the only way I could do that was just to go out and do a little drinking and this and that. And, back some of the old habits from the past. And, that wasn't good, but that's all I knew to do to get the stress off. But before I knew it, I found this marble-sized area there that was a hard area in my groin. And I went to the doctor, and he says, it's probably okay. He says, let's just send you home and come back in 3 months. Well, I didn't have to go back for long before it started getting bigger and bigger. And I called him. He says, you got to get in here and let's look at it. So I go back in, and he says, we got to do some surgery. He says, I want you to come in first thing in the morning. I'm going to do a little surgery. It probably won't be much to it, but let's do it. Let's see what it is. Well, when I got in, checked in the hospital, when I woke up from the surgery, I knew that wasn't good news, because I had this very large bandaged area, and it was very, very, painful. And I knew that wasn't good. And the doctor comes in to see me, and he says, well, I'm sorry to tell you that this cancer has spread. It's in your lymphatic system. He says, we had hoped this wouldn't have happened. He says, but now we've got to deal with it. He says to me, there's only one thing that I know to do that's really is going to be helpful at all with this, is it's chemotherapy, and it's experimental chemotherapy, and it has to do with elevating your temperature as high as we can with typhoid serum. He says, and it's going to be kind of considered a hypothermia treatment and then we're going to give you induce the chemotherapy right behind it. So we'll stimulate your immune system with this high temperature, and then we'll give you the chemo, and we'll do 80 treatments of this. And he says, we'll do 5 every 2 months, but we can't start until you recover from the surgery. So you'll be in here, and then we'll do that. So then the next thing, he says, you got to deal with this. All these lymph nodes are gone, and now we got a lot of drainage going on, and we've got to get a drainage pump, a lymph drainage pump, and you got to elevate your leg up, and several hours a day. And he says to me, if that doesn't, if you don't do this on a regular basis, you could end up with lymphedema and end up losing your leg. And he says, we don't want you to have that happen to you, and you got to get really serious about this. Well, I mean, here I got this chemo and the cancer, and I got to do this drainage. And now he says to me, after that, he says, you got a 20% chance of surviving 3 to 5 years.
I think one of the things that was so inspiring in the book was how you talked about the fact that what they kept giving you were these statistics and these, viewpoints that just about anybody who's been through a family member or personal journey with cancer hears. And so, your response to it, though, was very different. Can you share that with us? Because you really took, that old Texas saying, you took that bull by the horns. And
yes, that's a good saying. And what had happened when he told me I had a 20% chance of surviving 3 to 5 years if I could get through those treatments, the chemo, and get through them. Well, that didn't sound good to me at all. So here I am laying there. I'm desperate. Part of me wanted to just give up and just quit. And I just felt like I was just a sure goner, pretty much. And I started to pray. I got a phone call from a minister of mine that told me I had to fight like hell, basically. And he says, you cannot give up. I know you, James. He says, you can fight and you don't give up no matter what. And I started to pray after that phone call. And I prayed harder than I ever prayed in my life. I wasn't a real religious guy. I was just a guy that went to church occasionally and probably didn't pray very much, really. But I started to pray now because I felt that I needed some guidance from somewhere else other than where I'd had it. So I started to pray harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. And I prayed, and I felt like every cell in my body was praying. I felt like an energy came over me, like a calming energy, an energy that I've never experienced before. And it was there for sure. And I I just, prayed really hard. And after that prayer was over, I got a knock on the door, and a friend of mine, he came through, he knocks on that door, and I hadn't seen this guy in over 7 years. He was an old college buddy, and he just came out of the blue. He comes through the door, and he said, look, he says, I was driving around the area, and this was downtown Houston. I was driving around the area, and he says, I wanted to come see you. I heard from a friend of ours that you were in the hospital and battling cancer. And he says, I wanted to come see you, but, I didn't know if I should or not. But something told me you got to go there now. And I wasn't that far, and I just came over, and I hope it's okay. He had a piece of paper in his hand also. And he comes in and he says, I got this article from a friend of mine at the office where I work. We had a discussion yesterday about you, and he brought me this article, and it's about a guy that used a diet and lifestyle to cure himself of cancer. And I said, wow, I'm going to do what's in that paper there in your hand. He goes, well, you don't even know anything about it yet. And I said, I don't have to. I know I'm supposed to do this. I knew inside that whatever this other guy did was what I was going to do, even before I knew it. Yeah. And my intuition says, this is it, James. This is your key to healing. So I started to read that, and I got excited because it was about a fellow that was a well-known guy. He was on TV, and he'd written a book. And it was a book about macrobiotics, and it was a book how he used that diet to heal himself of prostate cancer. And he was a young man, and I really could relate to him. So anyway, I read this book because my friend went out and got it for me, and I was laying there in the hospital. I couldn't put it down, and I was very excited because if this would work for him, why wouldn't it work for me? And I talk about all this in my book, but, I had some hope now going on. I had some excitement. I had nothing before that. Now I felt like I have something I can do. Well, the next day I got another knock on the door, and my stepmother, she came in the door, and she had a book in her hand. And this book was about vitamin C and cancer. Mm-hmm. And it was written by Linus Pauling. He was the main author of the book. And there was the book talked about people that had terminally ill cancer. And when they took high amounts of vitamin C, it helped them to live much longer. Mm-hmm. And it helped them to survive much longer, and that people even got well on vitamin C, high amounts of vitamin C. Well, I got excited. Now I'm really excited because I had this diet. Now I learned about vitamin C, which I never knew much about. And I thought, well, if it'll work for these people, it could work for me. So I'm going to do both of those, and I'll do the chemo too, because the chemo, it's what I didn't know. I thought you had to do that too. So I'm going to do that. So the next day I got one more knock on the door, and lo and behold, it was this psychotherapist from the hospital, and he had heard I'd been very depressed, down and out, and he wanted to come talk to me. And he says, can I come in and talk to you? And I said, yes, you can, but I want to ask you if you've ever heard of something called macrobiotics. And he says, hold on a second. He just started to go off towards the door, and I thought, well, he's leaving. I said the wrong thing. And then he comes back, and he shuts it tight, and he comes back. He sits down next to the bed. He says, I have heard about it. He says, but you have to promise me you won't tell anybody that we spoke of this. He said, I'll get into trouble here, and I don't want to lose my job or my retirement pension. And he says, I've been here a long time, and you have to promise me. And I said, no problem. He went on to tell me how well it had done for people, this diet, and how he had heard so many good things, and how he even tried it, but he couldn't stick with it because there's a lot of work. And he told me, he says, there's a right way and a wrong way. He says, if you want to do it the right way, you're going to have better results. If you don't do it that way, I says, it doesn't work as well. Mm-hmm. So he says, you have to roll up your sleeves and do it the right way. But I think that you don't seem so depressed after all. He says, I'm surprised, but he says, it seems like you're ready to do something. And I think this would be very, very good for you. And he says, just remember what I've told you. So after this, I was very, very excited. And I knew that if he was going to do this and talk to me about this in secret, and close the door and all that, there must be really something to it. And he had confirmed this, and it made me really want to put 150% into it. So I was excited. And after he left, I made up my mind that I was going to do all these things, and I would do the chemo. So now it's time to do the chemo, and I got through it. And long story short, I ended up doing 10 treatments of the chemo, but my body wasn't responding to the chemo. The doctor came in and told me, he says, you're so sick. I was so sick from it. He says, your body's not really responding. He says, we had hoped it would respond better, and that's why you're not feeling well and you're getting sick. And I couldn't keep anything. I was throwing up, and it was terrible. And I said to him, I said, well, what would you do if this was your son or daughter? Would you do the same thing? He says, I'd do the same thing. I said, even if it kills them? He goes, well, that's all we know to do. Yeah. And I said, well, I could die in here, I said to him. He goes, well, he says, we're all going to die someday. And when he told me that, it upset me so much. I raised up in that hospital bed, and I was weak, and I had very little energy, and it just about took me down the drain. And I raised up in that bed, and I told him, I said, listen here. I said, if I could get out of this bed, and I said a couple of words to him because I was so mad. I said, if I could get out of this bed, I'd tear you apart. Yeah. That's exactly what I said. And he looked at me like he'd seen a ghost, and he ran out that door. This was this big shot doctor. And I never saw that doctor ever again after that, because 2 nights later, I decided to sneak out of the hospital at 2 a.m. And I never looked back. I snuck down the stairway.
It's probably harder to sneak out of a hospital these days than it was back then.
Yeah, well, I looked at the nurse's station, and there was nobody there. It was 2 a.m. And I looked, and I said, there's nobody here. I'm going for it. So I snuck along the wall, because I didn't want anybody to see me. And I went down to where it says the exit, and went down those stairs. And I was so weak and so sick that I got in my car that had been out in that parking lot, and I drove to my stepmother's house, because I didn't have a wife anymore and I needed someone to help me. So I went to my stepmother's house and ended up throwing up twice on the side of Interstate 45, out there on the way up there, and up to Huntsville, Texas is where I was going. And you know what? I decided that day that I was going to roll up my sleeves. I was going to go to war. I was going to fight this cancer like nobody had ever fought it before. And if it didn't work for me, it wasn't going to work for anybody else. And I was going to not go down easy. I was going to scratch, claw, kick, just swing at anything I had to get well. And I was not going to give in. And, I got into this diet. I got into eating the diet. I started to live the lifestyle, and I made up my mind that I was going to set the example for others to follow. And I
love that. One of the things that I thought was so fabulous in the book, because you have a lot of things in here about diet. You list a bunch of different foods that are choices for people, and really educating them about what's going on. But even more than that, I love, for example, chapter 9, where you're talking about the power of a positive mindset. And then, we're looking at, you're talking about different things like your whole experience with earthing, which you and I have talked about before, which is really wonderful. And then also looking at the pollutants, like you really created a lifestyle change. It wasn't just changing your diet. You looked at the entirety of your lifestyle and made those shifts everywhere that you had to. Can you share for us, like, what were some of the key moments for you when it came to, because I have to believe that back then some of these things were considered even more outlandish than they are now.
Oh, yeah, they were. And like I said, I didn't know anything about this, that I read everything I could. I wanted to know everything. And I wanted to, read other stories. I read other books that I learned about, and I felt that if it would work for them again, it worked for me. And I also learned that the cancer that I had wasn't just caused from being in the sun too much or this or that. It's caused from an immune system that was overburdened with toxic overload. And I had been exposed to a lot of petrochemicals, for example, having 10 years of having gas stations, and I was outside in college, and also after, I was always pumping gas. Right out there on Interstate 45, I had gas stations, and I'm pumping gasoline. I'm breathing this gasoline. And for years, I'm around this stuff. And I also lived around, high powered lines right up next to for years. And I didn't even really get into that in the book, but I did live around that. And I was also exposed to PVC glues for 7 years, out doing pipe fitting, breathing these chemicals. So I know that it's toxicity, along with poor diet, along with, in general, just the
environment,
the water, the environment, the stress that we all have to deal with in life, that it starts to really affect your immune system, and on mind, body, spirit levels. And I use this diet, and I know now why the diet works so well, because when you look at everything, you see, well, it's not a shock why it works, because the diet I was on was very high in fiber, and it was very high in cruciferous vegetables, which have the cancer fighting properties, and it was very high in the fermented foods that help with the intestinal flora, with the good bacteria, which is 70 to 80% of your immunity.
Sure.
And it also gave me this understanding that if I created this problem, or helped create it, 90% of it anyway, because cancer's really can only be about 10% genetics. Everyone has this idea that that they got cancer in their mother and their father and all this stuff, but it's maybe they inherited tendencies, bad habits, or whatever. But I understood that all this, and after I did it, it sort of released a lot of the fear, and it released this strong will kicked in, and I started to believe, and I exercised, I did deep breathing, and I meditated, and I visualized. Every day, visualization, sending this energy from here into the body that you're visualizing. It starts to turn that immune system around in that direction, and there's so much you could do. Of course, it's all in the book, and I explain all the things I did and what I'd do if I had to do it over, from the things I've learned. It talks about the diet I used, everything. It talks about the diet that I follow now.
Sure. And there's actually one other thing, because that actually led to a whole different path for you. So supplements were actually a key part of what was going on as well, and became your journey through supplements to heal your own cancer became the foundation to starting Uni Key Health.
Yeah. Yes.
And so in your opinion, what are the top supplements that people need to know about when it comes to supporting the body in its fight against cancer?
Well, the main thing, of course, that I discovered back then was vitamin C. Mm-hmm. And I've used vitamin C to this day. I use a lot of vitamin C. But you've got to understand that vitamin C is very important. And nowadays, there's a lot of people doing IV vitamin C, and that's like a healthy chemotherapy. And vitamin C is so important because there's been studies out there that show that cancer is a collagen disease. disease, and that cancer spreads through the connective tissue or the collagen, and it can enter into different parts of the body and the organs. Everything is pretty much made up of collagen, and the key factor is when you strengthen that collagen, the cancer cells have a hard time penetrating because they have a certain enzyme that's called nagalase, and the nagalase in the cancer cell can penetrate through the collagen. So we want to strengthen our collagen. We want to also strengthen our enzyme production, because enzymes are a huge thing, and that's the second thing I feel is the most important thing, because a lot of people that have cancer, and probably most people have cancer, have low enzyme numbers, a low enzyme bank. And enzymes are our body's, one of our body's most important mechanisms to destroy cancer on a regular basis, because we all have cancer cells in our body. And if we don't, our immune system's not strong enough to deal with this, then the cancer can start to multiply. And most people, have 700,000 or more cancer cells in their body on a daily basis. But what happens is if you let your immune system get too depleted from all the toxicity and the stress of life, and poor diet and all that, so now you start to increase the numbers of the cancer cells, and the more that are in there, you start to have these membranes that the cancer cells start to produce to protect themselves. It's like a fibrinogen layer that goes around that cancer cells produce that protects them from our immune system. So the enzymes help to break up these fibrinogen layers, this mucous membrane around these cells. So the higher amounts of enzymes, the better, because it eats through that protein layer and exposes the cancer cells so that the immune system can get after it. So enzymes is very important. There's a lot of research with this. That's one of the things. The next thing that's very important is lysine. The amino acid lysine. Lysine is an amino acid that has been shown to destroy nagalase, that enzyme we were talking about that goes after that the cancer cells use, that they have, that produce, that can metastasize with. So that's very important. The other one is proline. Proline is another amino acid. And amino acid that is important because it builds the collagen up, helps build the collagen. See, that we don't produce, the body doesn't manufacture or produce vitamin C or lysine. So we have to supplement it. And you got to do it from food or supplement. And it's hard to get enough through just food. Yeah. So these are very, very important. And I also use green tea extracts in green tea. I like that. It's very important. There's been a lot of research to show that green tea extract is very, very important because it stops, tumor production. Tumors can't grow very fast with it. And that's very important. But these are very, very important enzymes. And the next thing that I feel is so important is, what did we say earlier? We talked about 70, 80% of the immunity, and that's probiotics. Yeah. And because so many people have been on antibiotics all their life and been on this and that, and they're not eating enough foods that are fiber. Fiber helps produce as a prebiotic, and whole grains are prebiotics, but we have to supplement with it. I feel you can't get enough. You can eat, yogurt yogurt and plain yogurt, whatever, that's not pasteurized. But some people don't do well with the dairy, and I'm not a big fan of high amounts of dairy foods. Yeah. But I find that
is also a great choice, though. I love that.
Yeah, and the other thing, there's only one or two other supplements that are really a must, and that's like a thymus supplements. Very, very helpful for the thymus gland, which is our immune gland. And I like a little spleen also, thymus and spleen. And then I also think it's very important to take a good multiple every day, because it's hard to get enough in your diet. And you need to supplement to make sure you're getting enough of the vitamins and minerals that you need. And it goes on and on. My list does. I mean, there's vitamin D3 is very important. That vitamin D is anti-cancer. Any antioxidants, other antioxidants are very important. The vitamin A, E, magnesium is very important. It's good for immunity. Helps to, really relieve the stress in the body. Stress is, and 50% is believing in what you're doing or more. I believe if you don't have that.
That's why I love that you included that meditation piece, that mindfulness, and
yes,
it's so important for everyday life, and it's something that we tend to discount more than we really should.
Oh, I agree. And you want to make sure that you're eliminating and detoxifying on a regular basis. And it's so important because you're getting these toxins, no matter how strict your diet is, you're still absorbing toxins. And, I like to use one of my favorite things to use along with the supplements. And there's a lot of other supplements, the anti-inflammatories like the curcumin and all that is very important also. But is like the far infrared saunas. Mm-hmm. I love those because most people don't detoxify enough, and exercise is important because it increases your oxygen, but it does not detoxify you near at the level of a far infrared sauna. So I'm a big believer in those, and I try to use them almost every day. And it's amazing what it will do, for your system. It increases the oxygen in your system, helps with your immune system, and just gets rid of a lot of those heavy metal, that are so embedded in our system, and all the other toxins that we have in our bodies and that we get through just normal living.
Well, and see, I love that you have that multi-pronged approach. And the book is great. It is just filled with tips and resources and other people's stories as well. You share stories from other people in here and their journeys. It's just a great resource. So I know folks can get it on Amazon, but if they wanted to connect with you, or is there another way that they can get it as well if they wanted to be in touch with you?
They can go to iusetohavecancer.com, and they can do that. And when you go on there, there's links to Amazon, links to Barnes and Nobles, links to other bookstores, booksellers. But if you want to do that, you could get 3 free downloads. And one of them is information on my top supplements that I recommend. The other one is on 10 recipes, cancer-fighting recipes that I use on a regular basis that are very, very good recipes that I think will give people a good starting point as far as at least as prevention. This is more about prevention. And the other thing is my daily routine, the things that I do on a regular basis, the things that I take, the things that I do, my exercise program that I do, my deep breathing program, everything I do is in there. So that is all free. It's just a way to get extra information. And you can also find me at TempletonWellness.com, where we interview people that have had cancer, late stage cancer, stage 4 in most cases, that have survived for 10 years or more, and they will tell you exactly what they did, what they went through, what they did, what kind of program they did, what supplements they used, and it's all from them, straight from the horse's mouth, as they say. And if it works for them and what I tell you works for me, then why can't it work for other people too? It gives people a positive outlook, gives them hope, and that's what we're trying to sell here is hope. Yeah. And all the proceeds from that book go to the foundation to give back. And I've been lucky over the years, to be healthy and to survive for so long, and I've been able to help people in other areas in the health industry. But after the last few years, I started to see more and more of my good friends and my family and colleagues, get cancer, and many of them die of cancer. And it's really upset me. And I had a good story, and I've had something I could share with people. And I want to get that out there as much as I can, because people need this. And I mean, they're not all going to do what I did or these other people did, but at least it gives them something that they can grasp onto. It can give them hope. And if they're ready, you can't mess around with cancer a lot. You can make a decision, and some people are just very conventionally minded, and some people are the other way. But it is cancer doesn't have to be a death sentence. It doesn't have to be something that you have to just give up on. And I really believe that.
And I love that. I love that you're encouraging other people, that you're sharing their story, and like you said, you're promoting hope. And that's something that we all can use. Well, James, thank you so much for being here today. It has been fabulous hearing your story, and I so appreciate your huge heart for wanting to share and support other people. And folks, I'll put the links in the comments down below so that you'll be sure to be able to connect with James and get those free offers that he's sharing with you, plus also to be able to connect to the foundation if that's a place where you need more information or more support. So James, thanks again for being here. It's been really lovely.
Mira, it's been great to be with you, and thank you for everything you do. You're a real health warrior, and I appreciate you, and you're just a great lady, and thank you again so much.
Thanks so much. All right. Bye, folks. Talk to you later.